National Review and Public Discourse and lives in Round Rock. He and his wife, Deanne, have 3 children. So his talk is going to be about what does social science tell us about men and women. So give it up for Dr. Mark Ramirez.
Qualities and what that means, and this is stuff I used to teach in my intro class here, which none of you have taken because they kindly asked me to not teach it anymore about 4 years ago because I was not woke enough, basically. That was not a term that we were using back then, but it's a term that was in play. So, I'm going to start with sex distinctions in the workplace, in the social life, etc. And hopefully, if I race through this quickly, I'll end on sort of romantic relationships, which is kind of a sub-theme here. All right. I won't add commentary to that, but there's something to this cartoon, right? Now, sex and gender, how do we distinguish these? Basically, sex is considered a biological reality. I consider sexual dimorphism kind of what we mean when we mean sex. It's frankly unfortunate that our term for for sexual intercourse is sex, and also for the distinction between male and female is sex. But be that as it may, I think of sex as biological sexual dimorphism, men and women, male and female. There's an increasing amount of resistance to this, of course, today, which I think is resistance that you should push back upon. Now, I do distinguish between sex and gender because I think gender is the social construction here, right? Gender, in my mind, are normal curves, if you know this stuff, that sort of are rooted around the sexes, okay? That things can be more masculine or more feminine or more or less, and yet there is nothing inherent about gender that is directly tied to sex, right? So I think about gathering of water in much of sub-Saharan Africa is considered women's work, right? So, but that's a social construction. It could be different. It could be men, but somehow culturally this has come to be expected there. So, but gender as an idea typically builds on something because our cultures historically build upon nature, right? We send men to war on average because men are larger, stronger. Historically, that was very much a value. Today, that is not nearly as needed in wartime as it was in the past, although it's still valued, right? So we can talk about distinctions about that, but generally speaking, gender builds on something because culture builds on nature. Here's a picture of Camille Paglia, a sort of secular, atheistic, probably Christian wannabe, feminist scholar in Boston. And she says Mother Nature usually wins in the end, and Mother Nature is not a feminist, right? So she recognizes that men and women are distinctive and that there are historically roles that they play that are related to their biology. Now, there are real differences between men and women, but those differences and those abilities are often linked to disabilities. Things that one is better at than the other is better at some things than the others. It is not, this is a little bit related to sort of the idea of gender because plenty of times, like personality matters in here, and so that some people are just better at one thing than others. And sometimes you have men with particular kinds of personalities that lend themselves to some strengths and some weaknesses. Like my son, I have one son who is much more emotive than I am. It's a personality difference. It doesn't mean like, oh, somehow men shouldn't be emotive. Men typically are emotive in different ways, right? We'll get to that in a second. Okay. So, now, we hear a lot about sexual inequality today and in the past. What does sexual inequality mean? Well, historically, and in the academy, there's a lot of assumptions about, isn't there been something about male superiority? Don't men think they're better than women at things? Typically speaking, men don't think of themselves as superior to women, right? well, maybe it was collusion, right? That there's something called the patriarchy. And I'm happy to say that the patriarchy did exist. I'm not denying that, right? But it doesn't really exist in the same way today that people imagine that it still does, right? One way of evidencing this is the triumph of monogamous marriage systems, right? We take them for granted here. You should not take it for granted here. We are starting to see the erosion of the foundations of it appearing again. It has been, will be again. These things are cyclical in nature, but the end of the patriarchal system actually was very good for men, because then it wasn't a bunch of men hogging all the women, right? Monogamous marriage systems triumphed historically so that people could, one man could marry one woman and they could have children together, etc. Whereas if you go back to the Genghis Khan era, we're talking about harems, right? And only the powerful had men. Okay? I finally got around to watching Braveheart, or at least the first 30 minutes, on an airplane ride not too long ago. People seem to like it a lot, but you see in this image, right, where Mel Gibson's character's brand new wife is supposed to be taken by one of the opposition enemies and made, and to have had intercourse with her, because this was somehow the rule that the ruling powers had in place. This is sort of patriarchy, right? But it is inconsistent with sort of modern monogamous systems that we have. And it's good that we have those monogamous systems. However, we take it for granted, and we're seeing evidence that that's under fire, right? Because it's hard to defend monogamy in the public sphere today. You get kind of criticized for it. Well, wait until that system is gone and people will be a lot more miserable than they think they would be. Now, men perceive themselves typically as vulnerable. When people think, oh, men portray themselves as powerful, but men actually feel vulnerable. Women feel vulnerable, men feel vulnerable. Everybody feels vulnerable. Everybody has this sort of imposter syndrome going on, right? Now, why is this the case? Well, in men's case, most men know that there's a hierarchy out there and that they are not anywhere near the top, okay? I am a faculty member at a fairly prestigious Research One university. I've been promoted after much difficulty, etc. Like, I should think of myself as near the pinnacle of academic jobs, but I never have thought of myself that way. And frankly, if you really pick apart most of the faculty here, they don't feel that way either, right? We all feel like we're imposters. So, how do we then make a way towards what we might call equality between the sexes? Well, you get to equality not by insisting on sameness, that everybody ought to do the same thing, be as similar to each other as possible, or as interchangeability, which is sort of where we're moving, right? But by trade-offs. Okay? I see this in my own marriage. My wife works part-time, I work full-time. Like, well, how do we get to equality? We get there by trade-offs. What are you doing? What am I doing? What is she doing? How do we make this particular union work, right? Not to think of ourselves as like, oh, I could do this or she could do this. We're all interchangeable. Like, she does things she likes, feels good at. I do things I like and feel good at. Some men do the cooking. I don't. But that doesn't mean I'm like some domineering man who doesn't want to cook. Okay? We do different things and we're stronger at certain things than others. But increasingly, this is the trade-off system is being disregarded in favor of the notion of sameness and interchangeability, and like women and men are almost exactly the same, right? I'm not sure why the insistence on it. Back to the idea that like people are fundamentally uncomfortable with themselves. Now, in the workplace, how do we have sexual inequality in the workplace? Well, it brings up a lot of controversy. Harvard president got in big trouble for observing something that is basically a standard reality. I think he was making reference to something about sort of fewer women faculty in engineering or things like that. Is it about ability? He said, no, it's not about ability. It's about motivation. And all of a sudden, oh my goodness, are you saying that women aren't motivated? Well, basically, ability is about what you can do just as well as men and women. And motivation is about, like, well, what do you want to do, right? And he's making the simple observation that more men like that kind of work than women. It doesn't mean that women cannot like it. Plenty do, but not as many as men, right? So when you see this sort of, these two overlapping normal curves down there, this is from my favorite social psychologist, Roy Baumeister. Typically what we see is male and female differences are not about mean abilities. They're about sort of how flat or how sharp is the curve, okay? Women have a taller curve on average in terms of abilities, and men have a flatter curve, meaning men will be more overrepresented at the brightest end and at the dumbest end. They are more likely to be Nobel Prize winners, and our jails are full of men, not women, okay? Most of the time when you see dialogue and disputes about sexual inequality in the workplace, it's all about who's at the top, right? The glass ceiling, right? The glass ceiling is very fragile today, right? It's being broken with regularity, which is fine. What we don't see is sort of a concomitant examination of what's going on at the bottom, right? I mean, who dies in wartime? Men. Who is executed in the, in Huntsville, right? Men, right? Seldom do women suffer capital punishment. And usually when they do, it has always become this big deal, right? Well, it should be a big deal. It should be a big deal each time. But it's not, right? Because we expect certain things from men at the bottom. And frankly, that's unfortunate, right? But it's actually quite common, okay? All right, so the reality is basically we have different preferences, different motivations. Now, how do we think about men's interests in work? One of the things that's easily observable is that how numbers and mathematics are built into men's entertainment, right? And how do you know this stuff? I mean, it doesn't mean like they're better at numbers. It means somehow they're more interested in it, okay? So, I could get myself in trouble by a negative, with this example, but okay, who won the World Series? What was the score of the last game? 7-0. I heard two men's voices. Did I hear women's voices? Who won the last Super Bowl? Shout it. Last Super Bowl. Okay. Remember the score? 33-29. I don't remember the last score. All right. Who plays fantasy football, right? Men far more than women. Like, why? Well, it's because somehow numbers and sports are cooked into men's preferred forms of entertainment. Okay? Well, this spills over into the workplace, right? Men tend to be more interested in jobs involving sort of calculations and numbers, etc. It doesn't mean that women cannot do that. They have the same abilities. They tend to have different motivations. Now, at the same time, we should also think about what happens in the workplace, especially where there's sort of profound gender distinctions heavily favoring males, right? Those tend to be the most dangerous jobs. Well, why do men take dangerous jobs? Even ones that don't involve math, right? Why do they do that? Because men are more likely than women to trade risk for money. They just are likely to do that, right? Sacrificing safety for the greater prospects of rewards. Think of fishing in Alaska. I have no interest in fishing in Alaska, but some men do, more men than women. Men are more likely to sacrifice their relationships for their work, okay? So when we see questions about pay at the top levels, it is often resolved if you pay attention to the differential hours worked. Men tend to work more than women do. I'm not saying they can't. I mean, they can choose differently, but when given a choice, they choose to work more, okay? And is it strictly about preference? Is it strictly about money? I couldn't tell you, right? I've been working a legal case at the moment. So I've been working more than average, which was already not a small amount, but I'm stunned at lawyers, right? Plenty of which are women, but like lawyers work tons. It's like, because they're I think, why? And my daughter's thinking about law, but she's really, the money is not worth the time, right? I want some time, okay? Lawyers don't have time. Doctors don't have time. They trade time for money that they don't get to spend, don't get to enjoy. Sad. All right, so ability is what you can do. Motivation was what you want to do. Men and women are similar on ability, but distinctive on motivation. They just are motivated by different things. Are women more social? No. Depends on how you define it, right? One-on-one relationships, they tend to be better. If defined as involving larger groups, not necessarily. I used to think, of course, the answer to this was yes, that women are more social. But after observing my wife for 28 years of marriage, it's distinctive in how they are social. Men need other people just as much as women. We do care about relationships. We are sad when we don't have confidants. I'd say we have fewer opportunities to make those confidants. We see less opportunity. We move towards opportunity less often. But it's not as if that we long for relationships less. Some of it's about time, right? We give less time to it. Now, we also see this with regard to outsiders and insiders. Women tend to care less about what outsiders think than men do, right? Outsiders. On aggression, women are less apt to hit strangers than men, okay? Now, you'll see Instagram videos, I suppose, of interpersonal violence, a lot more than we used to, because everybody carries cameras around. But if we showed every time a man hit a woman, or a man hit another man, we'd just scroll on, because nobody cares, right? Because it's fairly normal. When you see a woman hit somebody, that will catch people's attention, because it's less common. Women are less likely to do this. On caring and help. Some men are inclined towards it. We often feel a little a pull towards that, but women feel a greater pull towards caring and helping. Crying, okay? Men cry less than women on average. Some of that's personality, some of it's not. What's at stake in crying for men? I mean, what do you think? Why do men cry less? Why, especially in groups, okay? In groups, why do men cry less? What does that signal? Weakness, vulnerability. Say again? You have to be strong. One of the things that's at risk is the morale of the group, right? Because if you start crying, because usually when somebody's crying, everybody feels bad. If you start crying, then I'm going to start crying. And this is, unacceptable, right? And sometimes it's not functional for the situation, right? So you see battlefield deaths. Men cry, okay? Both in the movies and in reality. But it's always this vulnerability. I don't know if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, a fairly famous movie. Captain Taylor cries, but he's shielding it from the men because he doesn't want them to see him, because that affects morale. It doesn't affect what they think of him. They already adore the man, but it affects morale, right? And so an example of this too, so men are trained then to sort of not want to cry ever, even if by themselves, right? My 21-year-old daughter cries more often than my 22-year-old son, but my 22-year-old son cries more often than I do. And every time he does, there's this little bit of I don't know how to deal with this. I know how to deal with my daughter crying, but my son, just stop that, right? Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because there's this sort of male disregard or penchant for this is vulnerability. If you're vulnerable, then I'm vulnerable, right? Anyways, I don't want to make more of that than what it's worth. But social psychologists, of which this is a fair amount of content, tend to believe then, all things considered, women historically have had more satisfying lives than men, even though the discourse is still sort of that is not the case, that somehow, no, it's men who've had the advantage historically. Now, back to what I said a little bit earlier, like the deal is like some men, a minority of men have had the advantage, but the majority of men live lives of quiet desperation, desperate quietness, and are lost to history. Whereas the average woman, over time, has reproduced, right? The average man, historically, until the monogamous system came, didn't necessarily so, right? We fundamentally disregard sort of that our modern societies are built on something, the monogamous marriage system, that didn't exist at one time, right? And Christianity, its advent, its development, its basically cultural triumph for centuries, is to be credited for sort of the wide uptake of this, right? And now we see as secularism takes over Europe and takes over the United States, slowly but surely, you're going to see that system recede. And do you think good times await? No, because fewer people are happy when monogamous systems start to collapse. Okay, finally, do I have 2 minutes? Yeah, I have more than 2 minutes. Sex differences in relationship behavior, okay? You've heard, so far as I can tell, this conference is a little bit more about relationships than about, workplace dynamics. But sex differences in relationships are among the strongest that we see. So back to here, it's like on sociability, there are effects, but it's not super strong. Workplace, there are effects, they're obvious, but not super strong. In terms of relationships, they're very strong, right? Women are apt to emphasize commitment before getting serious, before sex, right? More apt than men. Women are more likely to romanticize the experience of desire than men are. They tend to feel more guilt about sexual decisions, do more emotion work about sex than men. And their beliefs and their behaviors tend to be more plastic or malleable than men's are. And you can ask me questions about that afterwards. But I want to end on sort of dwelling on this modern mating pool, which has come to us because of the advent and uptake of contraception, exacerbated by technologies in other areas of the last few decades. But once upon a time, this pool was just, it didn't have corners to it. The point I want to talk about here is that what has become more important in modern mating dynamics is the presence of male-female distinctions. Those distinctions always existed in the past, but we didn't have we didn't have a mating pool where people could swim around in it a long time and never have a pregnancy, right? Now we have this possibility, this reality, which is what John Paul calls, the contraceptive mentality, right? Well, there's the contraceptive reality, and the reality lends itself to the mentality that sex, on average, is going to be infertile, right? This was not something that anybody prior to the mid to late 20th century could have ever taken for granted, right? And now it is taken for granted. That's what makes it a mentality. Now, so in the modern mating pool, you have corners that develop, right? In the previous mating pool, there weren't really corners. There was just sort of people got together. There was risk of pregnancy, and so commitment had to be shown. Now, pregnancy risk is diminished, so commitment doesn't have to be shown. Now commitment has to be discerned. And some people like commitment more than others, as I just said. So it means that men gravitate towards the corner where sex is easier and less committed, and women shift towards the corner where people are more interested in marriage and long-term commitment, okay? It just means then that, well, when you have a distinction here, whoever has power in that domain is more likely to get what they want, right? So who has more power in the corner of the mating market where there's more women, where there's more men than women? Who has more power when you are outnumbered? The one who outnumbers or the ones who are outnumbered? It's the ones who are outnumbered, right? If you are a minority, you can see this in dynamics on class trips and things like that. Anytime you are a minority, sexual minority in the room, you're more likely to draw attention, right? People go on field trips and there's these sort of short-term flings because of these dynamics. It's kind of weird, right? So men have less power in the corner of the market where women don't want to be. So women have more power over there, but at the same time, they have less power in sort of the monogamous marriage corner of the market, right? And we got this because of the uptake of pill and the advent of streaming pornography and, frankly, the advent of online dating, which encourages us to swipe and treat people like, commodities. No, yes, no. I mean, all of that doesn't respect the human person, right? Because if that did respect the human person, and if it was efficient and effective, we would see more marrying today because people are exposed to a lot more people. But we see less than we see less marrying today than more. All right, so in reality, this is what happens, right? Men perceive the picking pool as more advantageous to them than women do, because women don't want to be in the other corner of the market, and so they see their options as fewer than he does. All right, looks like I'm about out of time. And I'm going to save questions for if you have them out there or downstairs. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Regnerus. So now we're going to take time for lunch, 12:30. So so special announcements. Encourage y'all to stay in the building. First of all, it's cold, and second of all, just logistically, it's easier for us to come back.